Hey, everybody. Hope you're having a fantastic day today. We are going to be discussing the Calvin Parker story and the Pascagoula incident with our good friend, Philip Mantle. He's an acclaimed author and publisher at Flying Disc Press. We also want to get his thoughts on the state of ufology today. Are we making any progress? And what's some new info that maybe he could share with us and our viewers? So it's going to be a deep dive today. Our good friend Calvin Parker unfortunately passed not long ago, but his legacy continues on. And Philip is the torchbearer for him. And we're very happy to have him. So grab that cup of coffee in the comfy chair. Welcome to today's episode of Quantum Ladder Podcast. Let's do this. Welcome back to Quantum Ladder Podcast. My name is Louis Borges. Joining me as always, my good friend and co-host, Mr. Marquise Williams.
How you doing, sir? It's going to be a great day. This is an awesome interview we have for us today. So I'm really excited about this one, to talk about this.
Yeah,
incident.
for sure. And Philip Mantle is one of the most knowledgeable people on the subject. Been doing research for years, and even his publishing company, Flying Disc Press, they give an opportunity to a lot of authors and people to tell their story that wouldn't have otherwise got that. So we respect that. We want to have a chat. We are in 3 time zones today. It's 9 a.m. for me, it's noon for Marquise, and it's 5 p.m. for Philip. He is in the UK, and joining us from the UK in today's show, our good friend, Mr. Philip Mantle.
Yeah, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, gentlemen.
Thanks for being with us. Thanks for taking some time to do this. At first, we were starting off with the precipice of just doing science and technology. But when you get into the world of unknown and things that aren't explained, you have to kind of go back to what are people seeing? What are people experiencing? I think that is part of the scientific method. So to rule out all these things, and most of the science world is very divided on the topic of, UFOs, alien abductions. Most of them think that we're all nuts or, tinfoil hat wearing people, but it is important. There is a lot of work to be done. And a lot of us are science-minded people that either have had experiences or have, worked with people who have directly or indirectly. And you've done a lot of that. So thank you for being here on today's show with us. I thought to get us started, we could get just a quick video of Calvin telling the story in his own words. Many people may not be familiar with the Pascagoula incident, but here's a recent interview Calvin did before his passing that sort of summarizes what exactly happened. So we'll take a look.
I said I'm dying, so if I was ever going to tell the truth, this would be the time to do it.
First at 10 is a story many people haven't heard, many people have heard, I should say, but not all of them believed.
Still, nearly 50 years later, Calvin Parker is sticking to his story.
He says he was abducted by something out of this world in Pascagoula back in the 70s. And with all the recent UFO sightings, our Shelby Myers wanted to check in on Parker.
She's here in studio with us right now to find out more about the story. Shelby?
Yeah, Byron Lanise, Calvin Parker is always interested when UFO sightings or talk of aliens make national headlines. He's hoping to get some kind of answer as to what happened to him on the banks of the Pascagoula River all those years ago.
These blue hazy lights was reflected from behind, so that's about the time I stood up and looked behind to see what it was, what really was back there. And it was 3 bulky-looking creatures.
It was an encounter Calvin Parker says was out of this world.
I felt a shot immediately or something in my arm, and it just calmed me. It's like a calming agent. So This thing carried me to the steps of the craft.
On the banks of the Pascagoula River near Ingalls Shipyard at 19 years old, Parker says he and Charles Hickson were fishing when extraterrestrial beings carried them into a spaceship to examine them.
And she took her right hand and the two middle fingers on that. She started running down my throat. Well, I got to choking, having a hard time breathing. Well, she took out her fingers and just kind of stood there and kind of looked at me. Now, she didn't say nothing, but mentally I felt like she said, we're not going to harm you.
For close to 4 decades, it was Parker's deepest and darkest secret until 2018, and he decided to share it with the world, letting me interview him for the first time in 2019. He told me then, and he still tells me now, the same story of how aliens or some creatures abducted, examined, and dropped him back off. He still doesn't know why they did it or why they chose him. But every time UFOs make national headlines, he gets excited, but then disappointed again, wishing to finally get some of his questions answered about the encounter.
Why the government don't release what they know, or if they know anything, I don't know. But they not.
When I first interviewed him, Parker told me he came out of decades of hiding to leave behind a legacy, to tell people it really happened and he's not crazy. Tonight, his story is the same, but his outlook on life and the legacy he wants to leave behind has changed.
The alien story is just small. I want people to know that I love my family. I love life. It's been simple, but I think that the simpler, the better.
He is such a kind man. I've gotten to know him throughout the years. And tonight, Parker tells me he knows his life is short. He's making arrangements to set up his family for when he's gone. They really don't have much, but you can still support them by buying his book. It's actually on Amazon. I'm going to have more information on our website, fox10tv.com.
That is, that's an amazing account, by the way. I just want to say, so I found out that he lost his job because of the media attention that he received from this incident. So the idea that he is making up the story for fame or attention is ridiculous. His credibility has been essentially established through lie detector tests and sort of reporting on this over the years. And of course, he just seems like a very genuine and honest person. I personally, just from looking at the interviews, listening to other people talk about him, I believe him. I definitely think that he's telling the truth. And on top of that, I think that at this point, we know that there's serious validity to the incident. I'm curious about what you know about this incident that maybe people don't know about it, or something that you can highlight that most people don't think about or talk about.
Yeah, I mean, when I initially contacted Calvin, it wasn't to write a book or publish a book. I got the rights to Charlie Hickson's book that he co-authored with William Mendez in 1983. So I was going to republish that. I thought it would be nice if I could find Calvin and just get an interview. You know, that was my only intention. And from that initial contact, it turned into, in fact, 2 books written by Calvin. What a lot of people don't realize is the amount of other witnesses and information that since that initial contact, we've managed to uncover. I'll just give you one example. When Calvin's book came out, he did a little book signing event in Pascagoula, him and his wife, Waynette. And a gentleman came up, can I buy a book, Mr. Parker? Here's my $20 or whatever it was. And Waynette gives him the book. He'd signed it. As he's walking away, he says, oh, by the way, I saw the UFO that night, and off he's gone. Now, with no name, luckily someone was taking photographs. So we had a photograph of this gentleman. And I put it on social media, just saying I'd like to speak to him, nothing else. And a couple of days later, a lady contacted us. She said, I know who that is. I'll ask him if he speak to you. And he said yes. And his name was Mr. Louis Lee. He lived locally, of course. That night of October the 11th, 1973, Mr. Lee was working in the shipyard, right opposite from where Charlie and Calvin were, the other side of the river. And he told us, he said, Philip, he said, as soon as I got into my cab, which is about 10 or 12 feet off the ground, He says, I could see this darn thing out over the river. Yeah, and he watched it for quite a while. And the only reason he took his eyes off it is because his colleague down below was shouting, you know, what are you doing? Supposed to be working here. And he says, this thing wasn't up in the sky like a star or a planet. It was down over the river. And Mr. Lee was just one of many witnesses that either stepped forward or we managed to be able to locate by some other means. And literally, they are still coming forward to this very day. In this year alone, we've interviewed 3 more. And we'll release that information in due course. So the case itself becomes a lot bigger. It's not just about Charlie and Calvin. There are other witnesses. We have, for example, and I've spoken to this gentleman today. It was a Mr. Charles Rusty Anderson. And that night on the Pascagoula River, where Charlie and Calvin are, it's right next to Highway 90. This is not in the Mississippi swamplands. It's a, you know, and Mr. Anderson was driving over the bridge there, and he says, I saw this blue thing down below me. And he said, I thought it was going to crash. It was that low. Well, of course, that's precisely where Charlie and Calvin were. And he says the next day, he went down to see his aunt who lived down by the river. And he said, before I could open my mouth, she said, you'll never guess what I saw last night. And he said, oh, yeah, I will, because I saw it too. You know, so the story, once Calvin came out, did some local media, people started to coming forward. They realized he wasn't being made a fool of anymore, like they did back in 1973. He's being treated with respect. So they thought, and people are one of an age as well where, you know, I'm getting on in life now. I couldn't care less whether anybody believes me or not, but this is what I saw that night. And if you don't believe me, well, fair enough. You know, so the case has grown. It really has.
Yeah. And anytime you listen to Calvin talk, it's always the same story, sometimes a little repetitive, in fact, but he's never changed his story. He doesn't seem like the kind of person who's done this for fame. I mean, he didn't tell his wife for so many years. He didn't do public interviews for so many years. So he's not that guy looking for fame or fortune or anything else, just a simple guy. So what would you say to like skeptics that don't believe any of it? They think he's nuts. This never happened. Other people don't know what they saw. What would you say to anybody?
Well, you know, the skeptical attitude towards Charlie and Calvin, in my opinion, has changed somewhat, because back in 1973, the main skeptic that everybody heard of at that time was Philip Klass. Now, Mr. Klass is no longer with us, but he looked into this particular case, and I've read his file. Philip Klass has a file on Pascagoula. I think it's 140, 160 pages long. And in that file, there is nothing, absolutely nothing, to cast any doubt that Charlie and Calvin were not hoaxing. What Mr. Klass was looking for, he wasn't trying to do any research. He was just trying to find some mud he could sling. Because as you know, when you sling mud, some of it sticks sometimes. But he couldn't find any. There is nothing in there. He just said, well, it must be a hoax, you know, with no evidence whatsoever. Then the last item I read in full about the Pascagoula case from the Skeptical Society was in 2013. It's a 3-page article by a chap by the name of Joe Nichol. And Mr. Nichol wasn't calling it a hoax anymore. He was saying both of them had some kind of psychological aberration that night. It's quite a coincidence, isn't it, that it happens to 2 of them at the same time. And the hallucination that they have is pretty much the same as each other's, you know. So even the skeptics were now saying, we believe something happened to these 2 gentlemen that night, but we think it's this. But of course, they're just basing their, you know, theory on what Charlie and Calvin had to say. They're unaware of all the other information that we've gathered since then. I mean, in all honesty, Calvin was looking for an answer. And if me, you, or anyone else could have gone and said, here, Calvin, this is what happened to you and Charlie that night. We found an explanation for it, and it fits all the details, all the info we have. He would have been happy with that, because it would have meant closure. But of course, we've not been able to do that at all. So even the skeptics have moved. But there will be people who just say I don't believe. Well, that's fair enough. You know, Calvin said, if you don't believe me, I really don't care. You know, and you know, I'm pretty much of the same notion. If they don't want to believe it, well, that's fair enough. It's a free country.
Yeah, I'm with you, man. And here's, you know, you mentioned, I don't want to kind of beat the skeptic horse here, but I'm curious if you, when it comes to skeptics, do you think that they are more afraid of the truth than they are trying to just like debunk the truth? Because sometimes I feel like there's either a fear or, you know, I believe that with the one person who's a skeptic, I don't want to mention his name. There's a story that when he was a child, he was afraid that aliens were going to hurt him. And ever since that moment, this is his words, ever since the time that he had this fear of aliens coming to get him as a kid, he spent essentially the rest of his life trying to debunk it from that childhood trauma, that fear.
Yeah, well, I think we all should have a degree of skepticism. There's nothing wrong with being a bit of a skeptic, because we know that most sightings reported to us do have a conventional explanation. Any UFO researcher knows that. So you have to have that degree of skepticism. However, there is a big difference when it comes to being the debunker. You know, that's totally different to an air of skepticism. And I honestly don't, if they don't believe in any of this, and if you think it's all nonsense, why are they wasting their time trying to debunk it? I mean, why not just go away and get on with something else, you know? It's like me, I don't like cricket. Well, you don't see me going online bemoaning that cricket's the most boring game on earth and what, you know, it shouldn't be played and they're not real sportsmen, you know. You only play cricket because you can't play football, you know. Why would you waste your time doing that?
Yeah.
But there's nothing wrong with the degree of skepticism, but the out and right debunker, which Philip Glass was, I met Philip Glass, and he wasn't a skeptic, he was a debunker. Even when he couldn't find an answer to a case, he would just have his fallback position was, well, if I can't figure it out, it must be a hoax, with no evidence whatsoever. So the best thing to do is not take a blind bit of notice of them and just ignore them. You know, don't waste your time with them.
Yeah. Good point. One of the things I find fascinating about Calvin's story is, of all the people I've interviewed who have described experiences, typically they describe what they would call living creatures, living entities, things that are biological. Whereas Calvin's story, he almost describes these machine or robot-like creatures.
Yeah,
here's your book here. You've got a mock-up of it. But I mean, that's not your typical gray. This is like a scaly, ringed, three-horned
mummy.
Yeah, I mean, it was terrifying for them. And one of the reasons they say, well, it could be robots is because of the way they moved. They were like an emotionless object. And once Calvin was on board this thing, this he called it the big ugly creature, just stood to one side and never moved. And then this female appeared that looked almost human, but not quite. And she was the one in charge. And then she clicked her fingers and this thing, sprung into life. What is interesting, gents, new information that we've recently had passed on to us. At that time in 1973, the main UFO group was probably APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, which was run by a married couple, Coral and Jim Lorenzen. They're no longer with us. But they had a battery of consultants, one of which was Dr. James Harder. They sent Dr. Harder down to Pascagoula. Hynek appeared there as well. And, the APRO files after Jim and Coral passed away was kind of in limbo. We knew where they were, but couldn't get access to them. Anyway, at the end of last year, the gentleman who owned them passed them on to a gentleman by the name of David Marler, who's the executive director of the National UFO Historical Records Center in Albuquerque. So we're hoping that there's something in there from Dr. Harder. And hey, presto, within weeks, David's contacted me and said he has 5 recordings, most of which have never seen the light of day before. And one of those recordings is the late Dr. Alan Hynek, the man who invented the phrase close encounters, interviewing Sheriff Fred Diamond. Sheriff Fred Diamond was the man who was the sheriff at Jackson County that night and interviewed Charlie and Calvin when they contacted them. And they say they don't call them, when they talk about the three creatures, they don't call them the three creatures. They call them these three objects. And they too are talking about them as if they're robotic rather than, biological. And it's fascinating to hear Hynek and the sheriff, speaking about this. We're trying to have these tapes enhanced so they can be made public. But I've transcribed them, and it is a fascinating conversation. but they were talking about them as if they were, mechanical in some way. So that kind of backs up what Charlie and Calvin felt.
So then my question is, given that there's these two different types of entities or beings or whatever, what do you think he saw? I mean, everybody thinks of them as extraterrestrial. Some people say recently, especially with the hearings, that they're interdimensional, that there's a variety of different things. I mean, you're talking about grays, hybrids. What do you think he saw? Well, what does the evidence suggest?
We just can't say. What we can say is something really extraordinary happened to these two gentlemen that night. And they themselves couldn't figure it out. Calvin toyed with the idea. He called them aliens every now and again. There was a time in his life he thought, no, these were the bad guys. They hurt Calvin and Charlie. They restricted them. They left Calvin with what he called a curse. So he toyed with the idea that perhaps they were demonic in origin. And then he dismissed that because they were like nothing he'd ever read about in the Bible. Calvin was a simple man, but by no means stupid. He was an intelligent man, whereas Charlie was the opposite. He truly believed that these were beings from another world, and that something, they were going to be involved in something marvelous that would happen on Earth, and he'd be part of it. He became a contactee in essence. Of course, nothing did happen, and Charlie passed away in 2011. So both guys, reacted differently. They dealt with the encounter differently and had different viewpoints from it as well. So as an outsider looking in, it's very difficult. My first book, going back to 1994 here in the UK, was all about abduction accounts in Britain. And one of the things I asked the abductees were, what is your opinion on the nature and origin of your experience? Some said, yeah, aliens. Some said, no, I think it was some kind of spiritual experience. Others said, I have no idea, Philip. We're hoping you could tell me, So it's very, very difficult indeed. But what I will say is that something quite extraordinary happened that night. And there's a number of reasons why. When I met Calvin, I said, have you got any photographs, documentation? He said, no, I haven't. He said, my house was flooded in Hurricane Katrina. We lost everything. No photographs of his children and that kind of stuff. So I set about looking for documentation. Now, I have to remember, Hynek was down there in 1973. So I contacted the Center for UFO Studies, and they sent me a file. And in the middle of this file is a one-page typewritten document. So it's written on an old typewriter. And it's called Puncture Wounds. And it mentions that Charlie and Calvin are stripped down to their underwear and they're given the once-over, and that Charlie has puncture wounds on his arm and Calvin has them on his foot. Now, if you listen to what Charlie and Calvin said about their encounter, Charlie says, when these creatures got hold of me, I felt this prick on my arm. Calvin said, when I'm inside this thing and I'm laid on this table, they take my bottom clothing off and my shoes and socks and stick something in my foot and it hurts. So here we have a document describing what are minor injuries. These are not laser precision cuts or anything like that. A couple of years later, because this document mentions some photographs, a couple of years later, the gentleman who sent me that sends me an email, says, Philip, I assume you've got these, but I thought I'd send them anyway. And it is the photographs that go with that document. So there's Charlie's arm with these little marks on it, and there's Calvin's foot. So you have two gentlemen talking about receiving minor injuries. You have a document detailing what they look like. Then you have the photographs. Now, to me, that's a link right back to the encounter, saying there is a physical component to this. This wasn't all in their minds. They didn't have some kind of psychological aberration. And then on top of that, out of the blue, literally, Calvin did an interview with a local journalist, and she filmed it as well. She made a little mini documentary. So when you viewed the article online, halfway down was this little video. It was Calvin chatting away. Somebody grabbed that video and put it on YouTube. And I was reading the comments below it. And a person said, my mum and dad were on the opposite side of the river that night. They too saw the UFO. So I managed to find this person. It was a young lady, and she's talking about her mum and dad. They were Mr. and Mrs. Blair. They agreed to speak to us, so they didn't step forward. It was, and what Mrs. Blair told us, well, yeah, they were on the opposite side of the river that night. Her husband, Jerry, worked out offshore on the oil rigs. He serviced the oil rigs. There was a little boat there waiting to take them out, and they were waiting for the boss to come. And he was late. So, they sat in the car. She said he's facing the water. And she said, we saw this thing come down the river, this blue thing. And it got to a position when it stopped and made various maneuvers. She knew there was no airfield there or helicopter pad. So Mr. and Mrs. Blair decided to go to this little boat, even though the boss hadn't come, and put his belongings on it. You've got a suitcase and some clothing and so on. He says, as we're walking along this pier, it's dark now, there's a huge splash. And this creature pops up right in front of Mrs. Blair. And I mean, right up close and personal. And she called it the grey man. And it went back down into the water and never come up again. She ran up to the boat. She threw Mr. Blair's clothing on it. She said, this was about 9 o'clock. So she decided, I'm going home. And she got back to the car and it was midnight. So where the hell did these 3 hours go? Yeah. So Mr. Blair came home from working offshore. Don't tell anybody. Don't tell a word. But down the years, they had 2 daughters. And that lady who made that comment was their youngest daughter. So we're interviewing them and they met Calvin. And they talked about seeing this blue thing and this creature. And then Mr. Blair took ill, seriously ill. And he was in hospital and he's going to have an operation. And his wife, Maria, was there. And he got Maria to phone me from the hospital. He was literally sat in his hospital bed. And he said, we were abducted. We were there that night. He survived the operation. And he went on to tell his wife, Maria, about their own encounter. She had little flashbacks of it, if you like, little snippets. And once he started telling his story, these little snippets kind of fell into place, Sadly, eventually Mr. Blair died, and he was still talking about this right up to him passing away. It's almost like a deathbed confession, but it lasted weeks and weeks, Yeah. And we also then, Maria wanted to undergo hypnosis. So we arranged that for her in 2022. And she says under the hypnosis, these creatures were interested in her eggs and our DNA. And they wanted to create beings that could walk amongst us unnoticed. I mean, that's what she said. What is interesting, we hired a professional hypnotherapist who had no connection to this field at all. And we didn't tell her anything either. We just said a date, a time, and a location. And so when Maria's talking, you see the look on the face of the hypnotherapist as well, And we had it filmed. We had it professionally filmed. And then just the back end of last year, we had another interview with Maria, on camera. She sat with a colleague out there in Ocean Springs. And she claims to have seen the creatures again. She had another sighting, but she said that night they actually did witness what happened to Charlie and Calvin. She could see what was happening across the river, but she just couldn't make any sense of it. It completely bamboozled her. She thought this was men. You know, she never thought about UFOs or aliens. She thought there was some kind, this was men of some kind, you know, that were doing this. And of course, when she saw it on the television, she thought, oh my God, you know, it wasn't men. So she claims to have seen that as well. But Mr. Blair did say, you know, he called them the grey humanoids. And we even have a little film of him on a little mobile, sat on his hospital bed, you know, stickers still hanging off him and wires in the background. So the case gets even bigger. You now have a second encounter. It's interesting what Mrs. Blair did say. She said the abduction wasn't meant for Charlie and Calvin that night. It was meant for us. And I said, well, why do you say that? She said, well, we were supposed to be there at that time and at that location. Charlie and Calvin only decided to go that way that day when they were coming home from work. They just said, shall we go fishing tonight? Oh, yeah. So she said they're almost like collateral damage, you know, but they were the intended target and not Charlie and Calvin. So it's the story starts to grow, and make of it what you will.
You mentioned the detective or the sheriff, and at some point after their experience, they did wind up, I guess, at the police station of some sort. And there was a recording that was being made that they didn't know about, but it was Charlie Hickson and Calvin Parker sitting in a room shortly after this incident. And I think for me, this is the most believable thing, because they didn't know they were being recorded. And they're shaken, you know, basically saying, like, what the hell was that? Did you see that? What was up with that door? And I've got the recording here. It's 3 minutes and change. So let's take a listen. For anybody who's listening on the radio side of UNX Network or Apple Podcast, you can get the full imagery and video on our YouTube channel here. It is a little bit mumbled because it's an older video, but there are closed captions. So let's take a look at what these gentlemen were saying pretty well immediately after the incident.
Something like that is scary. You slow them down to death, you know? Jesus Christ. You hear about something like that, but you can't believe it. Yeah, you hear something. I know. There ain't something the United States can have up there. No, I'm sure they ain't. This shit, I'm like, man, I ought to take that. Ain't shit. Well, I know. I come one down and you got scared me to death, too, something. I just stand there crying right now. I can't say I know that most of them bad back to nobody's legs. That's what I thought. I had been through enough of hell on this earth, and now I have to go do something like this. Why they just take that? I don't know. I just tell you, I gotta get home with the bed and get some nerve pills or something, see the doctor or something. I can't stand it. I'm back to all the pain. I'll take you by the, when they get through this, we'll go by the burn. I'll get you something. Set you down so you get some damn sleep. I keep sleeping out like it is. I was damn near crazy. But yeah, when he brought you out of that damn thing, and when he brought me out, well, I like to know when the hell you know. God damn, I like to know when the hell got you straightened out, man. When they launched, I remember my heart, they just froze out just like that. I couldn't move it, just like a step on a damn rattlesnake. They didn't do me that way, though. I've never seen one like that before in my life. Just how you can't make people believe that, though. I don't know, so you won't believe that, because they better wake up and start believing. Damn right, I wake up and start believing. Damn right. This is the way I see it. I can't figure out the damn door. You see how that door will come in on that same side? Yeah, I don't know how to open something. I don't know. I didn't see no door swing. I don't know how to open. I don't know how to see it open. You see something, and look around, them damn blue lights and them some bitches are just like that, they come out. Yeah, no, you can't believe it. You can't make people believe it. I paralyzed right there. I couldn't believe it. They won't believe it on these days. They won't believe it on these days. Might be too late.
Can you tell me about the lie detector test?
Well, so that was run by Pilkington. Was it Pilkington?
Pennington. That they run this type of test about 6 times a day. And when they were asked to come over here to talk to these people, they had in their mind that it was just a big joke. if I understand it correctly, they ran one test on Mr. Hickson. The machine showed that he was telling the truth. Then they run another one. And then the examiner, he began to wonder himself. So he ran the third test, and he believed just what Mr. Hickson had told him.
Mr. Booth, tell me what happened that night in October.
Well, I got up and had turned off the TV and come to the front door, which you could see right behind me. Just as usual, checking to see if it was locked. So I looked out the window at the top, and naturally I saw this object above the street light out there. So naturally it caught my eye with the lights was on. I couldn't hear any racket or anything. So I opened the door after a few seconds to step out to see if I could really tell what it was. It just took off.
Can you describe it?
Well, it was round, had lights all the way around it, turning in a counter-clockwise motion. It had a dome on top with a bright light shining out through the top of it. To tell the actual figure of it or anything, you couldn't tell. You could just see the lights and the one on top.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, so, that recording that you played is known as the secret tape. They were at Jackson County Sheriff's Office. They'd been interviewed separately, so they were put in a room together and left alone for a few minutes. And unbeknownst to them, there's a recorder in the desk next to them. The deputy came a few minutes later and received, took it out. And the law enforcement guys then changed their attitude towards them. They thought this tape would catch them out, but it didn't. And it, they tended to believe them. Same with the polygraph. I actually have the printout of that polygraph result. I have the graph of it. And I also contacted Pennington Detective Agencies, I think it became, before the COVID lockdown, and got some more information from them. And you saw there Larry Booth. He was one of several witnesses who came forward actually back in 1973. For example, we communicated with the police dispatcher who was on duty that night. He's the one that took the call from Charlie Hickson. And he said he had over 50 people calling in that night reporting UFOs. And when he went back to the police station, there was even more there reporting it in person. So again, it's not just what happened to Charlie and Calvin. There were other things seen and happening in and around the area that evening and subsequent evenings. And the secret tape is fascinating. It really is, because you can hear what the two gentlemen say. You can hear the tone, the fear in their voice, the desperation that nobody's going to believe them, and it's an amazing piece of evidence. If you talk about other well-known abduction cases, the probably best well-known are Betty and Barney Hill and Travis Walton. Well, they have nothing like this.
Yeah.
I mean, it was years later, 4 or 5 years before the Betty and Barney, story came out. With Travis, there are no third-party independent witnesses. We have that with Charlie and Calvin. We have photographs of their minor injuries. We have the secret tape, as you've just played, and other witnesses in and around the area, and a lot more. So, somebody asked me today, what do you think of this case? I said, it's almost perfect. Apart from having an alien in the fridge, it's got everything. That's why we called the book Beyond Reasonable Doubt. Dr. Scott and I had a working title for it. And then I was watching a courtroom drama one night, and they said on this, we have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And I emailed Irene and said, this is the title for the book. And what we say about the book is, if we could take all these witnesses and all this evidence into a court, we could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that something extraordinary happened that night. And there's nothing I've seen or heard that as yet that would change my mind.
Yeah, not to be like offensive to the skeptics, but clearly they haven't, no offense, but they have not done enough research to really make a comment about this situation. I was going to ask you, why did you stick to this case so focused and heavily over the years? But I think I get it. I think I get it now.
I didn't really have any choice, because I set out to get an interview with with Calvin, that turned into a book that, much to our surprise, took off, and Calvin was willing to be interviewed. He spoke at a few conferences. He was already ill then, but not seriously ill, and we didn't know it would be a terminal illness. I think Calvin might have had an inkling in the back of his mind that if I don't do this now, I'll never get the chance to do it again, and he was right, of course. And none of us expected anything. We thought we'd write, Calvin's book, and that would be it, but of course, people came forward. We had other leads, so we followed them. I'll give you an example. When Calvin's book came out, a gentleman from Greece contacted us. He's called Stephanos Panagiotakis. Took me a long while to practice that name.
Yes.
But in 1981, Stephanos was in the Greek merchant navy. He was on a ship. He's a radio operator, and he was a UFO researcher. And his favorite case was the Pascagoula incident. Just by chance, the ship he was on docked in Pascagoula, and it was held up there for a week. So he set off to get an interview with Charles Hickson, which he did. He went to the police station to see if they could help him with any other info, and they said, you need to go and speak to this chap. He's called Pastor Emmanuel Sigalis. Here's his address. So Stephanos literally went and knocked on this gentleman's door. Just by luck, this gentleman was of Greek origin, and he was a clergyman, so he invited Stephanos in, and he had seen the UFO that night. Not only by himself, but with a chap by the name of Raymond Broadus, who was part of the police and probation service, and a young lady, a church volunteer. What they were doing that night, the three of them, we have the Pastor Sigalis, Mr. Broadus, and this young lady in the back of the car. They were going to a church meeting that dealt with people who had alcohol problems. And this young lady sees this thing approaching out of the side window, and she alerted the two guys in the front, and it came right over in front of them, right across the road, heading down towards the Pascagoula River. Now, Stephanos had an interview with this chap, but they died, they've since gone. Mr. Broadus had since passed away. But what about this young lady in the back of the car? We found her name, and her name was Joanne Hallmark. She's not a native of the area. She lived there for only a short while. We even found an old black and white photograph of her. So I searched online. She had a Facebook account that hadn't been used in decades. She had a Twitter account, the same there, never used. So I left it. About a year later, I went back to one of those accounts, and on it was the mention of a church. And I literally put this church into Google, and lo and behold, it was there. And I found the church website, and on it, it had a general email, info@church, whatever. So I sent them an email just saying, I'm looking for this lady, Joanne Hallmark. She worked with Pastor Sigalis in 1973 in Pascagoula, Mississippi. That's all I said. And I said, if she's still around, could you please pass this email on to her? I'd like to talk to her. About 4 weeks later, Mrs. Hallmark replied. They passed on the email. She confirmed she worked with the pastor. She was in Pascagoula in 1973. So then I said, well, what I really want to talk to you about is this, the UFO sighting that night. And she come back and told us the whole story. She gave us a telephone number. My colleague, my co-author, Dr. Irina Scott, phoned her up. She's now living in Maryland, not in Mississippi, and interviewed her on the phone. We sent her the old black and white photograph of her, and she sent us a up-to-date photograph as she looks today, and allowed us to use that in the book. So this was how things developed. Mrs. Hallmark didn't step forward. We managed to find her, as we've done with other people as well. And so the reason I stuck with the case is because we didn't have any option. Things were coming our way. And like Calvin, I thought if we don't interview these people now, we'll probably never get another chance. And I'll give you an example why. I think it was 2019, just before Christmas. Calvin was in a local store, and a gentleman came up and said, "Oh, Mr. Parker, I saw the UFO that night." And Calvin said, "I knew the guy's name." So Calvin said, "I'll tell you what, why don't I speak to you about it after Christmas?" Well, okay, that'll be great. Of course, this gentleman passed away before Calvin had the chance to speak to him. So, when we had the opportunity to interview somebody or do something or find something, it was only going to be probably a lot of the time just that one chance. It's like Mr. Lewis Lee. Mr. Lee's since passed away. Charlie and Calvin, the day after their encounter, were examined by a doctor. I forget his name, Boros. I think his name's Boros or something. We managed to find him, and he was 90 years of age, and we interviewed him twice. And it's all in the book. Again, he has since passed away. Captain Glenn Ryder was one of the guys who interviewed Charlie and Calvin that night. We interviewed him. He has since passed away. So, we had to make sure that if we got some information or a witness to speak to, better do it now, better do it now.
Absolutely. Totally fascinating. And with, it's not a coincidence when you have corroborating witness accounts, physical evidence, recordings. I mean, if this was a murder case, it'd be enough to put you away for the rest of your life, right? So definitely not a lack of evidence.
Well, when you talk about recordings, I told you about the 5 recordings that just been sent to us from the APRO files. One of them is, again, it's Calvin under hypnosis with Dr. James Harder just on the Saturday. So it's 3 days after the encounter. And Calvin is under hypnosis. It's quite poor quality is the recording, but we're trying to have it enhanced. But Calvin is asked under this hypnosis. It only lasts, I think, 11 minutes. Calvin is asked what the creatures look like, and he says they have the face of a ghost. And it's not just what he says, it's how he says it, and it sends a shiver down your spine. It really does. And, I know people say, hypnotic testimony is not to be trusted. And I understand that argument. But if we didn't release it, they'd accuse us of hiding something. So when you do release it, they say it's nonsense. It's like a polygraph test. If you fail a polygraph test, you're a liar. If you pass a polygraph test, they say, well, it doesn't matter. It's not admissible in court anymore. So you can't win. You can't.
Or you're really good. You fix the machine. Somehow you beat the test. There's always, debunkers don't need to look far to find.
So what Dr. Scott and I decided to do was publish anything and everything that we have, and leave you, the reader, to draw your own conclusion. And that's exactly what we've done.
Yeah, and you've done a great job with the book. We're going to talk more about it in the second half. Right now, we are at our halfway point. We're going to take our 5-minute break. So everybody refill your drinks, and we'll see you back here in 5 minutes. And we are back with the second half of Quantum Letter Podcast. Joining us today, our good friend Philip Mantle. We've been discussing the Calvin Parker story, or the Pascagoula incident, as it's also well known as. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about ufology as a whole right now, Philip. Are we making any progress? I mean, we seem to get one step forward, 5 steps back. What are your thoughts as somebody who sees it from all angles and who has global connections? Are we getting anywhere with this whole thing?
Well, it's in the mainstream is the topic. We have to acknowledge that, and long may it last. But it's not the first time it's been a mainstream topic. I remember going back to the 1990s when Dr. John Mack, a Harvard professor, indeed, came out and said, I don't know why you're dismissing all these abduction claims, because there is something to this subject. And I was fortunate enough to meet Dr. Mack several times. I think the last time we met was at a conference in America. We had lunch together, and he told me about some of his projects he was thinking about for the future. But sadly, that never manifested. So, it's good to have the topic in the mainstream. But certainly if you use Twitter or X or whatever the hell it's called now, what is curious, and I personally think this is deliberate. If you look at the main sort of disclosure lobby of people, Leslie Keane, Ralph Blumenthal, Jeremy Corbell, and others, Dave Grush, not one of them has mentioned abductions. Not one of them. Mm-hmm. Dave Grush has said, in his statement under oath, that people have been murdered to protect these secrets. Mm-hmm. But there's not a mention of abductions anywhere. I know Leslie Keane was interviewed somewhere, and she said that she'd written a particular article, and she purposely omitted certain facts to try and give the subject an air of credibility. And I think that bit that was edited out is the abduction phenomena, because if these people are claiming that we are being contacted by beings not of this earth, however the hell they get here is another argument, but not of this earth, then to admit, and well, hang on a minute, they might also be abducting humans without any control, that's a big step. That's a huge step for them. So that part's being omitted, and I believe on purpose. But sadly, with people like Mr. Grush, I'm sure he's an honest man and he believes in what he's saying. He's just one of it in a long line. I mean, you go back right to Major Donald Kehoe in the 1950s, who made the same claims. The government's covering things up. We have crashed flying saucers, and we have alien bodies in storage somewhere. So that, the narrative really hasn't changed. It's just a different format of being out to spread the word these days. But, I hope I'm wrong. I hope something tangible does come out of all this. It's great to see hearings with members of Congress involved. NASA, whether you believe them or not, is a different matter, but NASA with their own project. And here's another thing for you. It's kind of linked to it is linked to the Pascagoula case. Just after our book was published at the end of last year, a young lady by the name of Chelsea Norton Prince, who runs the Ocean Springs Historical Society in Mississippi, is a fan of the Pascagoula case, and they have a Facebook page, and she put a couple of things on it. One of her members, a lady by the name of Bethany Fayard, contacted and said, I've got 2 boxes of papers that used to belong to Charles Hickson, and 2 boxes full of them. Charlie died in 2011, and her parents had bought his house, and these papers were in it. So Chelsea contacted me, and I have a copy of all of them. She digitized the whole lot for me. There's no smoking guns in here. There's some fascinating stuff, but there's one letter from a NASA physicist. And he said, I asked NASA to look into your case, and they weren't interested. So NASA had the opportunity back in 1973 to investigate a case like this, because there's one of their employees saying you ought to look at this, and they ignored it. So let's hope that this time around, and they've set up this organization Arrow, and there's supposed to be a safe way of people to report things to them. It seems to me that they're trying to concentrate just on military or military aviators in, you know, as a priority. But what would happen if one of these military personnel reported that they'd had an encounter like Charlie or Calvin? Would they take it seriously? I don't know, because all they seem to be talking about is sightings and bits of film. You know, not every sighting will have a piece of film to go with it. And let's be honest, gentlemen, the 3 pieces of film that started all this came out in 2017. You know, the Go Fast, the Tic Tac, and the Gimbal, and they were photographed by Top Gun Navy pilots. You know, Top Gun. The aircraft they're flying is $100 million plus each, but yet all they can film is a fuzzy blob. We complain like hellfire that people out in the street see a UFO and they film it on their cell phone, and it's rubbish. Well, sadly, guys, these 3 bits of film aren't much better when you look at it in the cold light of day. You know, they're not. But yet you'll see military activity sadly in Eastern Europe and now in Yemen and things like that. They can send a drone in and it can see the people in the street. Yeah, when we have these guys filming a UFO, all we get is rubbish. So there's something that doesn't add up here. And I don't, you know, I'll leave you to make up your own decision. But nonetheless, it did spark interest. I think that article in the New York Times in 2017, the online version, I think it's one of the biggest liked articles they've ever had. So that shows you the amount of interest it's generated, and long may it last.
Yeah, there is a lot. I'm going to try to. I don't want to monologue here, but there were this idea that you mentioned about them keeping out the abduction experiences from the public conversation, and that may be a strategic thing, which I believe I'm with you on that one. I think they are strategically not putting that into their conversation publicly for several reasons. One of them is because recently, after the hearings, I believe Anna Paulina mentioned about this idea of it being interdimensional, that we should focus on David Grush's comments about the phenomena being interdimensional. That's what Anna Paulina said. David Grush mentioned that. Then there's this interview I watched with Tucker Carlson. It's also floating around. It's being resurfaced again, where he talked to, I think it was Dave Rubin, or I don't remember exactly who it was at this point. I apologize. But in that interview, the clip that people keep putting on X, Twitter, is him mentioning how that there are 2 things that concern him, and one of the things that concern him, that scares him, is the UFO story. And he mentioned it's because there's a spiritual element to it, and that the truth of this phenomena, according to what he's been told in his his connections, along with the interviewer, was so dark that he won't even tell his wife because he doesn't want to disturb her, and that he understands why this has been kept secret for so long. I say that among many other kind of ramblings on the internet about, from these people, from other figures as well, about this idea that the phenomena, these phenomena may be doing something to the human soul, if we have one, whatever that means, life after death, that after we die, they may be as a kind of interfering with the process, the natural process of things afterwards. Now, if that's true, that would probably be a very terrifying, sentiment versus, oh, there's life out there. That's not a scary thing.
No.
But hearing about what's happening,
well, the way you look at this, you have to look at what's happened since Kenneth Arnold. When Kenneth Arnold had his sighting, the argument was, is that one of us or is it the Russians? Nobody wanted to say, oh, it might not be either. They wanted to give it that air of credibility. In the 1950s comes the Space Brothers. And of course, the aliens now, they're aliens and they come from the dark side of the moon or Venus. Well, our technology expanded and we found out there's nothing on the dark side of the moon. And the atmosphere is so, on Venus is so toxic, it cannot contain, life. So then they changed it. Well, it comes from the outer planets. Well, then we found out the outer planets are not actually solid. They're gas giants. So there ain't nobody living on them. And then, of course, it's Alpha Centauri or it's Zeta Reticuli. Since then, certainly in the last probably 10 years, we've learned an awful lot more about, the universe. It is far bigger than we ever imagined.
I apologize for interrupting. I only add this to what you just said, because a lot of those ideas have come from the interactions with these beings,
absolutely,
not from people. They've been telling
absolutely.
people.
But the science now tell us that the visible universe, so that's the thing we can detect, is 48 billion light years across. There are at least 2 trillion galaxies. And within those 2 trillion galaxies, I cannot calculate how many stars and planets there would be. So the fact is, the distance across the universe has grown. But potentially there's more chance, theoretically, of other life existing, because there's a lot more planets now. So the goalposts have been moved. So now we don't say, oh, it's linear travel. They've come to us, traveling faster than light from Alpha Centauri or Zeta Reticuli, because we realize if they come from some of the other stars, they'll never get here, in linear travel. So they have to think of another way. It's like one of the most famous cases in the UK is the Rendlesham Forest events of December 1980. One of the main witnesses, and I honestly believe the gentleman, is Mr. Jim Penniston. Jim and his colleague John Burroughs ventured into Rendlesham Forest that night and encountered something. Some years later, Jim says it's us. It was a time travel. It was a vehicle from our future. So now, but then when you talk about we can't travel between the stars, it's just impossible. We have to have another way of doing it, and it's interdimensional. I met Professor Michio Kaku, well-known physicist in the US. I met him some years ago, and I had a sit down with him in his hotel and interviewed him, and he showed me how it works. It's very simple. You give me a piece of paper like that. It says to go from A to B takes a long time. If you bend the sheet, from A to B is much shorter.
Yeah.
So that's what others are talking. But when Mr. Grush made his comments in Congress about interdimensional travel and the laws of physics and so on, I know a gentleman who used to be the science correspondent for the BBC, and I asked him, and he says the guy's talking nonsense. It's not even high school physics he's talking about. He has no idea what he's talking about, because you can make such statements, and if we're honest, most of us are not clued up on physics, are we? We're not physicists.
No.
So, but he's just the Donald Kehoe of today, but in a different, with today's technology and today's science around us. Same story.
But what about Eric Davis? He says, I'm so sorry for keep asking, because these are questions that are literally irking me, and I ask people just like yourself who've researched this topic for much longer than I have and with much more vigor. Eric Davis mentioned some very similar sentiments that are dark and also close to this idea of interdimensionality or whatever that means. And again, I'm not a scientist or a physicist at all, but he is a scientist and a pretty
But when you look at Eric Davis, you look at them not on his own. He was also involved with Colm Kelleher, Kit Green, Hal Puthoff, and there's been a small clique of these guys who've been involved in a number of things down the decades, some of which even goes as far back as testing the psychic Uri Geller.
Yep.
And they claimed his powers were correct. Now, I've met Uri, I've been in his house and interviewed him, and I'm not going to say he's a faker, because he'll sue you. But, I'm not convinced. But these guys are. So you have to remember they were also part of NIDS, which was Bigelow's National Institute of Discovery Sciences. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I was involved with, unfortunately, was the alien autopsy hoax. Mm-hmm. Now, not that long ago, a set of emails was dumped online. It's an email thread between all of these guys we've just mentioned. And at that time, they were working for NIDS, for Bigelow. I think the thread is 2000 to 2001. And they're talking about the alien autopsy film. And all these guys come to the conclusion that it's real. And it's not. It's 100% fake. I know the guy that made it. I know the sculptor who made the dummies. So you have to look at these gentlemen and then put it in some kind of context. He may be saying it's dark this, it's dark that, it's spiritual, you know. What's he going to move on to next? You know, Uri Geller was real, the alien autopsy was real, you know. But you have to remember, these guys are scientists, and it's when they say these things, it's not necessarily a fact, although they'll pronounce it and it sounds like a fact, but it's not. It's just their opinions, their thoughts, their theories, you know, which are just as valid as anybody else. We have to realize they're not facts. You know, everybody's entitled to an opinion, but nobody's entitled to make up facts. It's as simple as that.
Thank you for it, and thank you for bearing with me on that one.
No, it's fine.
Very well said. I want to ask you about one of the most divisive people in the UFO world. Some people believe him emphatically. Other people say he's full of it. What are your thoughts on Mr. Bob Lazar?
Well, you know, I don't believe a word he says. You know, it's as simple as that. I mean, Mr. Lazar says that all of his documentation, all of his qualifications were all disappeared, you know, but he said he went to MIT. So did all his classmates disappear? Did his professors, the lectures he went to, disappear? You know, I've got a photograph. I can take you, okay, I've got one school photograph, that's all I've got, but I can take you to people I went to school with. And they'll remember me. You know, they might not all like me, but they'll certainly be able to remember me, you know. And he has none of that. And of course, one of the great believers in this kind of stuff was Stanton Friedman, the late Stanton Friedman. And if anybody would have had the opportunity to rubber stamp Bob Lazar as being authentic, it would have been Stan. But quite the opposite happened. He said, no, this guy's, you know, not who he claims to be. And he doesn't have these qualifications. And he certainly didn't work at Area 51. And, you know, but again, people want to believe him. He seems a nice enough guy. He may believe what he says himself. I tried to get a conversation with him some years back, but I think I got through to his business partner, but I never quite managed to get a hold of him. But, you know, it's Mr. Lazar's not my cup of tea. Put some element 115 on the table. Let's have it tested. Out there, there you go.
Yeah, this is I have to say again, I apologize for keep coming up with more and more to that question, but I've just been desperately trying to find out how other people see these different topics, these different aspects of the phenomena. And for me, you know, I want to know what do people think it is? What do you think it is? What do you think? I mean, if you were to give it a best guess, recently I was looking on X, and you mentioned about how, you know, terrible it can be. There was a certain debunker who claims to be a researcher that loves to FOIA request documents and stuff like that. And he doesn't have a position. His position seems to be that they are government or other, potentially probably adversarial, but no position at all. Do you have a position on what these
absolutely.
things are?
I mean, when we talk about UFOs, we should use the phrase phenomena. It's
right.
Plural. So there are a number of things involved in it. First one that we all know is misidentification of abnormal everyday things. You know, then there are some probably military vehicles that are being tested, whatever,
right,
that never make it, you know, into production. There probably is unknown aerial phenomena that we haven't quite got to grasp with, plasmas, like if you go to look at Project Hessdalen and the lights seen in the Hessdalen Valley, captured on film and photographed. There's other hotspots around the world that have these lights.
Marfa lights in Texas.
Marfa lights, the Min lights in Australia.
Yep.
So there's that as well. But they don't account for the very, very small percentage of encounters and unknowns. So what you have to do is look back in time. And whatever you do, mankind, and I mean mankind, not Mr. Parker, not Mr. Hickson, but mankind in general, has always had encounters with the unknown. And they interpreted it as they did in their day. You know, we interpret it today as possibly aliens coming from somewhere or another. But way back when, if you go back 200 years, some of these encounters would have been looked on as being from the fairy lore. And I'll give you an example. There's an old story. Again, it's a couple hundred years old. The master's on his horse going home with his his servant, walking behind him, and he's fed up waiting for his servant. So he says, "We're almost home. I'll carry on the horse and you come along behind me." His servant turns up a couple of hours late. And he says, "Where the hell have you been?" Words to that effect. And he says, "I got attacked by the fairy folk and taken into a fairy mound. And it was illuminated inside with lanterns, but I couldn't see them." And he says, I didn't think I was late. I only seemed like a few minutes. And of course, they go back to the location. There's nothing there. If that was to happen today, what would we call it? Missing time.
Oh,
it'd be a missing time encounter.
Yeah.
So we interpret things the way of our culture. That's the word I'm looking for. So the further you go back, the culture is different.
Ezekiel's wheel.
Yeah. So we have these all around the world. For example, in the UK, I wrote a book called UFO Landings UK. And if you look at the creatures involved in these things, they are a complete mixture.
Mm-hmm.
As are we here in Britain. We are a multicultural country. The first people who lived in this country were of Germanic origin. We had the Romans here for several hundred years, and the legionnaires came from all across Europe. We had the Vikings throughout Scandinavia. Then as we grew, we plundered the world and had our empire, and of course we brought back people from that. And in latter days, we've had people come from the Caribbean and Africa and live. So we are a whole mixture of cultures here in Britain. And that's looks to me as like that's reflected when people have these experiences. For example, in the Republic of Ireland, it's not part of Britain. They're highly religious Catholic country. Very rare you get these kind of experiences from it. But what they do have, they had a sighting of the Blessed Virgin Mary at a place called Knock, and they have a shrine there to it, and they go and celebrate it. So these experiences of being with mankind since we've first stepped out of the water or climbed down from the trees, or if you believe in creation, since God created us. So it's something here on earth that we are experiencing. What it is, your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah.
And
I want to get into your books.
In 100 years' time, we'll still be having them, but they'll be explained away in the culture of our ancestors in the future. Sorry, gentlemen, sorry.
Yeah, no, and that's perfect because it brings me to my next question. Where do you see the next 12, 24 months? Do you see anything major happening, or is it just going to be sort of a slow and steady? What do you think? If you had the crystal ball, where do you see the next 2 years in the world of ufology?
I suspect there'll be, and this is just going on experience, there'll be a major hoax of some kind that will take people's eye off the ball. And will have the UFO community at each other's throats. A bit like the alien autopsy film did, a bit like the MJ12 documents did back in the 80s. They're fake. And it might be a piece of film, might be a document, but it'll get people excited and riled up. I hope I'm wrong, but the time is right for the perfect hoax,
the false flag.
Yeah. Well, it may be just some idiot that thinks he can get away with it. I'm not saying it's come from any particular department or it's, some people just like to make a hoax out of devilment to show that they can do it.
Yeah.
But I think the hearings will continue and there'll be more interest in that. I think it's certainly going to stay in the public eye for quite a while. I don't see that falling away. I think it'll only intensify. Be interesting to see what NASA come up with. Because if it's dumb, people will call them out as being dumb. Calvin learnt me the word dumbass. So and there will be, I'm sure there'll be rather than a flood, there'll be bits and pieces start to emerge that we'll all debate and we'll all have different opinions on, but there'll be opinions. But it will keep it in the public eye, and it'll be interesting to see where that leads.
And you've been a busy guy in terms of books. I went on Amazon. This is just some of the books that you've written. Another slide here. You mentioned the UFO Landings UK book as well. These are all fantastic reads. They all have awesome reviews. Look, these are all 4.5 star, 4 3/4 star, 5 star. And the one that led us to this episode is Beyond Reasonable Doubt, the Pascagoula alien abduction, co-authored with Dr. Irina Scott. What's next for you, Philip? What do you got planned?
Yeah, well, we've made a documentary about Pascagoula that's done and finished. It's with a British company, so we're just waiting for them to release it. But we're also making another one with Canadian producer Darcy Weir.
My
so
buddy.
that's it. Yeah, he's a good guy. That's in the pipeline, and we've got. I'm writing another book. I said to my wife the other day, I don't think I'll write any more books. I've got none planned. She said, well, what about all that stuff you've got? Oh, well, fair enough. I'll start. So some of the cases I've been involved with down the years, I'm just going to put them in a book so you can see for yourself. And I've started that. I'm sure something Pascagoula-wise will crop up. I don't know what. I don't know where. And what I've said to people, myself and Irina have gathered all this information and interviewed all these witnesses because we have this amazing technology today. However, even with something like Roswell, that's never going to go away. But all the witnesses to Roswell are now deceased. So we need to be looking in people's basements, in their attic, in their garage. There may be a letter, a document, a photograph. Who knows what will be in there. For example, I just published a book called Europe's Roswell, 40 Years of Impact, by a British writer called Mark Holley. And it's about some wreckage they found on a farm in Wales in 1983. And there's photographs of this stuff. It's not any. So I said, well, who's got it? He said, oh, it's this chap in Wales. He's got some of this material. So I contacted him, and they presto, he sent me some. So, we're having that tested. And that was just by simply asking questions and being polite and saying, well, where is it? A colleague of mine once said, if anybody, makes a statement about they've got this or they've got that, they've got the other, then challenge them. Just show me. It's like Mr. Coulthard in Australia claims he knows the location where a UFO is has a building built around it, but he won't say anything. What? Can you remember the film Jerry Maguire? What was the catchphrase? Show me the money.
Yeah. Show me the money.
In other words, show me the evidence. Show me. We can all make up stories, but show me. It should be, like I said to Mark Holley, well, this guy in Wales claims he's got some alleged UFO debris. I'll ask him. And he sent me it, and I have pictures of it. And I have, in fact, it's in my filing cabinet right next to me now. So it's a simple thing. Research can be as simple as just ask the question. Some years back, I used to be a conference organizer, and one of the conferences, the main speaker was Whitley Strieber. And at the end of the presentation, Whitley's taking question and answers, from the audience. Somebody says to him, are we getting any nearer, Mr. Strieber? What Whitley said, and he doesn't remember this, but I found it quite profound. He says, we're learning to ask better questions. And I think that's what we have to continue to learn today, is to ask better questions.
Final thought to you, Marquise.
Yeah, I am really happy that I got a chance to talk to you. This was awesome. This was really awesome. Honestly, I'm surprised about how this went, because I was afraid I would, there was a lot of information that I wanted to go over with you, but you went into really extensive detail. I really appreciate this conversation. I really appreciate you doing this with us. And honestly, I just want to thank you. And I also thank you for dealing with me. I tend to be overzealous when it comes to my questions. So when I interjected a couple of times, I apologize. That is a problem of mine.
You've no need to apologize. I do exactly the same.
Yeah, thank you.
You've got something to say it,
Thank you, man. Thank you.
And thank you from me as well, Philip. I'm sure we'll do another one of these in the future. It's your first time to Quantum Ladder Podcast, and you've got an open invite anytime you'd like to come back. You get some new findings or some information people need to know, give us a ring, and we'll certainly have you back on.
Maybe when the documentary comes out, we may get back, because in that there are a lot of these witnesses have been harping on about on camera for the first time, so you'll be able to see it for yourself. And if the producer's up for it, we'll get him, on board with us as well. But, I thank you, John. Good morning, Louis. Good afternoon, Marquis. And good evening from the UK.
Good evening, my
Awesome.
friend. Good evening.
Very well said. And with that, we'll bring today's show to a close. On behalf of myself, Louis Borges, myself, and my co-host Marquise Williams, and our illustrious guest Philip Mantle, we want to thank you all for watching at home. Be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our various channels if you haven't already. And basically, that's all we got for today. Be good to each other, and we'll see you next week.